very excited today to be joined by Philip Reeve, and Philip is an illustrator, author, got an amazing imagination, and now, to add to the string to his bow, filmmaker. So my first question to you, Philip, is how did you get into storytelling and films, and why?
God, I can't remember because it was so long ago. I mean, I've got stories that I wrote when I was like 6 or 7. So it's obviously something that I was doing from, as soon as I was able to write, and probably before that. I mean, I guess it all sort of comes from playing, really. It comes from playing little games with toy cars and soldiers and things on the carpet when I was 4 or 5, and you just kind of keep going, and it becomes more elaborate. But this idea of creating little worlds and inventing things to happen in them, I never quite grew out of that. Films were always really my sort of first love, but of course I didn't have the wherewithal to make them because I was growing up in the 1970s. Eventually I got hold of my dad's Super 8 camera and I was able to start making little things, but until then I was basically drawing and writing stories down, and I sort of kept on juggling all those things all through my teens and early 20s. I did all of the above, but I had no idea how you got into making movies. Had no idea how you could get into the film industry at all. It didn't really occur to me as a possibility, or writing either, really. But illustration seemed to be like something I could make a career out of. So I ended up, I went to art college and studied illustration, and then eventually became an illustrator. I worked on some of the kind of horrible histories books and things like that.
Oh, wow.
And the filmmaking fell by the wayside because it was, my ambitions were so far beyond the technology that I had available to me. I was sort of trying to make these huge epics on Super 8, and eventually, and then I think I moved on to video, but it was kind of analog video. It was very, very hard to edit and things, and it was very clunky. So I just started writing. I had this huge project that eventually sort of turned into Mortal Engines, my first book, because it was just so far beyond my abilities to make it as a film that I just wrote it instead. And with one bound, I became a novelist. So I kind of gave up films at that point. But just lately, I kind of got the itch again.
So going back to your youth, to give you an example, my first film I remember seeing was E.T. It was at Brighton Cinema, and it was amazing. It was like John Williams music and stuff, and it's like the spaceship had left and all the people were chasing the little alien. What was your moment of going to a cinema that sort of inspired you to, into your literature, your storytelling?
Yeah, I remember always loving going to the cinema, but I don't remember necessarily what I was seeing. I suppose it was like Disney cartoons and things when I was a kid. Star Wars came out when I was 11 or 12. Or the sort of the bow wave of publicity for it arrived when I was 11, and I got very excited about it. And then when I saw it, I was 12, and that was a big moment, because that was sort of like, oh, they made a film for me. And then there was sort of like, there was kind of a whole bunch of films that came out through the 80s that were like sort of stepping stones for me. Excalibur, John Boorman's Excalibur, was kind of a huge influence on me. That was sort of, I had Excalibur instead of university, really. It kind of opened doors for me into all sorts of art and literature and stuff. I loved it. And it's no coincidence that now that I've gone back to movie making, I made an Arthurian film, although it's of a very different sort. From those sorts of things, I kind of branched out into all the other stuff, kind of all sorts of arty things that I got into when I was older at college. But yeah, probably Star Wars was the first sort of big one for me. I think before that there were like the Ray Harryhausen Sinbad movies. I remember going to see some of those, and they were sort of not quite right. They were sort of near enough, but they weren't quite what I was after. And then Star Wars came out. I thought, yes, okay, this is it. This is the thing.
So sort of on that, so you're an illustrator. How did that influence your we're talking Star Wars, and we think of Mortal Engines, what Peter Jackson did to your book and the world creation. How, being the illustrator, did it influence your creation of worlds within your books?
I don't think it's about, I guess it's about a visual imagination. It's about being able to visualize something in your head, and then try and put it on the page. So I don't think it sort of comes from, I don't think it comes from being an illustrator and then going on to write. It comes from having these sort of weird visions in your head, and then you try and get them out in some way. And actually, being able to visualize things in your head, I think, is probably not good for a visual artist, strangely. My friend Sarah McIntyre, who I do books with now, she handles all the illustration side of stuff. Talking to her, I realized that she doesn't really have a very clear image of the picture when she starts. She sort of has to draw, a mouse and a boat. So she just starts drawing, goes, oh, this is cool, this is a mouse and a boat, it's great. And the invention all happens on the page. Whereas if I have to draw a mouse and a boat, I have a very clear picture of it in my head. And as soon as I start making marks on the paper, it's not as good as the picture in my head. So it's very frustrating. And for that reason, I don't really illustrate anymore. I've never really enjoyed drawing, because I've never managed to produce anything that I thought was as good as the image I had in my mind before I started. So in a way, books are a much more satisfying way of doing that. And when I'm writing, I kind of have, it's like I have a film running in my head that I can sort of re-edit and recut as I go, and I just describe it.
But your imagination is amazing. I mean, so like the way Peter Jackson turned Mortal Engines into a film. I always remember there was a teaser trailer the year before the film came out of the city of London chasing the other city.
Right.
For you to come up with that, absolutely amazing. It reminds me of like a bonkers Terry Gilliam idea that he would do in animation, but
yeah,
it looked
yeah, I mean, yes, it sort of comes from similar places. I mean, really, where it comes from is I started out writing, this sort of last film project I did in my 20s, was a sort of post-apocalyptic Victorian. It's what would now be called steampunk, but I don't think we had steampunk then. I think I invented it, basically, and nobody noticed, and then somebody else invented it. So it was a sort of post-apocalyptic Victoria. It was Victorian Mad Max, effectively. I really didn't work as a ultra low budget film. So I started writing it as a story with some of the same characters and things. And I thought it needed something big in it. I just thought it needed a big sort of central thing to hold the story together. And I thought putting everybody in a city would be quite a good idea. And then I thought, what's special about the city? Or maybe it moves around on big caterpillar tracks like a huge tank. But why would it do that? This seems a stupid idea. And then I thought, well, it chases other cities, it chases them and catches them and eats them up, which instantly is, I think, quite. It's a cartoon idea. It is a Terry Gilliam sort of. It's very silly, but it's also got a certain kind of resonance. And when you start to go into the details of it, how everything works and how it's all stuck together, and who lives there and where they live and stuff, it's endlessly. You can kind of delve into it in great depth. And I think the appeal of it really is taking a really stupid idea like that and trying to make it feel real, trying to pile so much detail of sights and sounds and smells into it that it sort of convinces you that it's a real place.
You've done an amazing thing, like I like Charles Dickens, for instance, how Charles Dickens takes something in real life, like A Christmas Carol or something, and puts it in like a fantasy place.
Yeah,
fans and that idea.
Yeah, well, I mean, Dickens, I love Dickens, and he's a big kind of, it sounds pretentious to say it because Mortal Engines is like a sort of a big spoof action movie nonsense thing, but it is kind of quite inspired by Dickens. I think that's why it's got this slightly Victorian sense to it.
Yeah.
But yeah, he does, and he writes, when a book like Bleak House, which is probably my favorite novel. It's about, ostensibly about real 19th century London, but it's so weird, it's so fantastical and sort of Kafkaesque. That was one of the things that got me. I read, having been brought up on Star Wars and Excalibur and stuff, I was very into sci-fi and fantasy when I was a teenager, and then coming across Bleak House made me realize, oh, actually, okay, real literature can do this too. It has all that sort of strangeness and dreamlike qualities to it, but it's also, you know, it's set in the real world.
So you made a short film called Gwenevere.
Yes.
And my first question about the film, you wrote a book called Here Lies Arthur.
Mm-hmm.
What is your fascination with King Arthur and Merlin? And
I don't know, really. It sort of goes back to Excalibur, really, I guess, which is you know, if you're not old enough to remember it or know it, it's John Boorman's film from 1981, which is a sort of mad. I think of it as the last great film of the 70s. You know, it's got a very, it came out in 81, but it's got a very sort of 70s vibe. And it's a sort of mad dash through the whole Arthurian legend from beginning to end. And until that, a lot of things that I'd liked as a child, a lot of the stories and artwork and stuff were sort of Arthurian adjacent. You know, I liked all the stuff of Arthurian legend, the misty woods and the knights on their quests and all that sort of stuff. But I'd never really found a version of the story that grabbed me, and Excalibur absolutely did. It's very lurid, and it really sort of reaches out the cinema screen and grabs you by the collar and makes you watch it. And when it was finished, I ran off to the library and sort of started reading all the Arthur stuff I could, and that kind of obsessed me for a couple of years. And then I kind of forgot about it, but it sort of recurs every 10 years or so. I kind of find myself drifting back to Arthur. So about 10 years ago or so, I wrote Here Lies Arthur, which is a very kind of sort of stripped down, kind of ostensibly realistic Arthur story set in the Dark Ages, set in the sort of the 5th century. And Arthur's a kind of a gangster warlord in post-Roman Britain. And then I kind of forgot it again. And then I came back to it when I started thinking about making a film. I live on Dartmoor, so I've got this lovely landscape around me, which is very, very evocative. Lots of misty woods and rocks and fast-flowing rivers and things. And I thought, well, we could make an Arthurian movie. And I didn't want to do the kind of stripped down, realistic, grotty kind of thing anymore. So I went for something that looks a lot more like a kind of pre-Raphaelite painting, hopefully, or a series of pre-Raphaelite paintings being paraded in front of you. So it's a very sort of romantic thing of it's based much more on Mallory and things like that. And it's about, but it isn't, I couldn't actually afford to do a proper Arthurian story because that would involve castles and horses and stuff that I can't get. So basically, when you write a short film, you have to kind of, it's completely different to writing a book. You have to think, well, what can I afford? What can we actually realistically hope to do? And I thought we could realistically hope to pay 4 or 5 actors for 4 or 5 days and get some costumes and one medieval building. So I've come up with a story about Gwenevere right at the end of the Arthurian tale. When her affair with Lancelot has been exposed and the round table has fallen apart and things, and she's been packed off to the abbey at Amesbury to live out her remaining days in prayer and penitence. So she's travelling cross country with one comedy relief lady in waiting and one very grumpy young knight who'd rather be doing anything else than being her bodyguard. And they run into trouble on the way. They come to a farmhouse and find that it's the people there are sort of imperiled by this evil supernatural knight who haunts the woods nearby. And Gwenevere decides that she has to sort it out because Arthurian movies, I have noticed, having watched all of the ones I could find, they do tend to turn into westerns. So I thought there was no point resisting this. So it does. Oh, yeah, there does come a point where she has to sort of strap on her sword and go and clean up dodge. And it's about half an hour long, and I think I'm quite happy with it. It's crude. I mean, it's not crude in the sense of being rude or anything. It's crude in the sense that it's quite crude. Yeah. Or not crudely made exactly. I think it's remarkably beautiful. I've got my wife Sarah is a photographer, and she handled all the kind of technical side of it, which would be way beyond me. And it does look lovely, I think. We found some lovely locations, and we got great costumes. When I first mentioned online that I was going to be doing this thing, there's a science fiction writer called Jane Fenn who lives nearby, and she got in touch and said, "Oh, I'm also medieval reenactor, and that you can borrow all my costumes. It was fantastic.
Brilliant. That's what you want.
Yeah.
That's the message you want. Yes, yeah. I'll take them.
So we have all these sort of great dresses, and she made some stuff for us as well. And so all the costumes actually, they sort of have the weight, their wool and linen, you know, their proper fabrics and things. So it looks, I think it looks pretty good. But I wasn't trying to do anything particularly slick. I do quite like the kind of home movie. I'm actually fond of the old films I made when I was like 14 on Super 8. I think there's a kind of a purity that comes from, you know, not having very many, you know, not having lots of special effects available, or you know, kind of
gives it more real look. And yeah, one thing you don't have to pay for is you got an amazing location.
Absolutely, yeah. We found some great places, and people were very willing to let us use their fields and woods and barns and things for locations. So we did very well from that. So yeah, you know, if you want to see lots of lovely medieval costumers being paraded around bits of Dartmoor by good actors, this is the film for you.
So what was it like casting your actors? Because obviously you write your books, and you've got an imagination of what the people might look like or something, and the reader's got an imagination what they look like. What was it like for you casting your own film?
Yeah, it's there's well, the lady in waiting, Laudine, who's the sort of comedy relief part of it. She's played by Joanna Neary, who is a comedian I know from my Brighton days, and she's been in various things that I've written in the past. And right when I first sort of thought I wanted to do it, I thought, who do I want in it? Jo. So I wrote this part around her, and she was like, she's sort of the core of it. She's not the lead, but she's sort of the main character in a way. She has a voiceover which tells some of the story, and I think she's the sort of the heart of it. So that was really set up, and then after that I didn't really know who I was casting or how to get hold of them. So I just sort of faffed about. And yeah, it's interesting. I didn't really have a clear vision in mind of like Gwenevere, who is the main character. I knew she had to be, you know, a woman in her sort of 40s or 50s. And I thought, we'll try and cast somebody local, because that will be, you know, that will be easy. We don't want to bring people in from miles and miles away. And eventually I came across Laura Frances Martin, who comes from Cornwall. So we did have to bring her in from miles and miles away. But she's brilliant. And as soon as I saw her, you know, I just thought, oh yeah, that's Gwenevere. So I pestered her until she took the part, and she was terrific. She was so good. Young knight, played by Johnny Hibbs, who is a local lad. He's Dartmoor. Actor and dancer, and I sort of vaguely knew he was at primary school with my son, so I thought, oh yes, okay, I'll get in touch with Johnny, and he was up for it, so that was good. And everybody else just sort of fell into place around that. Those are the three sort of, I think they are only professional actors. Or Aaron Hawkins, who plays Lancelot in a tiny cameo, he's another actor, but a friend of Laura's who came in. And then we have some local people who I know from like the village panto and things like that, who turned up, but you know, just have the right faces and do good work. And then we had some fabulous sort of like volunteers who appeared. A young woman called Marika Keane got in touch with me again when I first started mentioning this online, and said, oh, I'd come along and help out and do anything. So I wasn't quite sure what we were going to use her for, but it turned out we used her for everything. She brought her sister and her mum along, and they are all in it as well. So you know, extras and crew appeared from as if by magic. Yeah, it was a really good experience, actually. It was really nice. Nice, friendly, happy shoot.
Yeah, that's what you want. So what was it like directing your film on Dartmoor?
Well, it was sort of panic inducing, really, but because of course so much of it is about, we had such limited time. You know, Laura could only spend us like sort of 3 or 4 days for our main shoot, so we had to kind of lock everything in around that. And then we were worrying that the weather would be bad, or somebody would get COVID or just a cold or something that would have knocked us out. But luckily, nothing. You know, luckily, the weather behaved and everything was okay. But yeah, we were working at a mad speed. I mean, it was potty, the amount of setups we were trying to cram into every day. And I did find that the stuff that I'd sort of planned and visualized, again, it comes back to that visualizing stuff in my mind, stuff that I'd visualized in my mind very carefully, and made big plans for and sort of storyboarding and stuff, kind of fell apart instantly on contact with reality. And we just ended up kind of busking it. And I had to put, sort of mend it all in the edit as best I could. Whereas the stuff that I hadn't really been able to plan, like there's a whole sequence set in a farmhouse. Like they arrive at this farm, and in the script, it basically just says sort of stuff happens at the farm, because until really the week of shooting, I wasn't entirely sure who was going to be there, or what we were going to have, or exactly what the building looked like, So we just kind of improvised, and that worked really well. So I guess we were prepared. We had all the nice stuff, all the costumes, and lots of props and bits and pieces around. So it was kind of improvising from after quite a lot of preparation. But those sequences worked like a dream. The bits where we didn't really know what we were doing. So that was a lesson for the future.
And looking at the trailer, it's very nice. It's lit really well. With photography and stuff, it needs to be lit really well for that time. And so you look at, that's one thing about Excalibur. It's the way it's shot and the way it's lit is marvelous. How far were these locations to light and things like inside? And
we didn't really use. My wife is, as I say, a photographer, so she knows her stuff with all this. So she was in charge of the lighting and things like that. So, but we didn't really have a lot. So when we're outdoors, it's almost entirely natural light, except just occasionally we had like a tiny little handheld battery-powered light, which we would just put onto people's faces occasionally, or a reflector, just to bounce a bit of light onto people if we needed to. But basically, it's all natural light outdoors. And then indoors, we had one or two big lamps, which we kind of shunted around until it looked right. And I think it does. I think it looks. I'm very pleased with the way it's turned out, lighting-wise. Yeah, it was lovely.
Oh, amazing. Yeah, I'm going to mention something. You wrote a musical, The Ministry of Biscuits. Is that right?
Yeah.
I was like, The Ministry of Biscuits, and I mentioned that because there's a name of a gentleman you work with that did the music for this. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, Brian Mitchell, who is one of the few people I've met in my life who I would honestly describe as a genius. I think he genuinely is touched by genius. And he's a very good, very, very good playwright. He writes plays mostly with Joseph Nixon, and they're just magnificent. If you ever get the chance to see Those Magnificent Men, or there are a whole bunch of them, Mitchell and Nixon, look them up. But I've been lucky enough to write a couple of musicals with him as well, and he's a great composer. He's a fantastic musician. He's able to do sort of the Ministry of Biscuits is a sort of 1940s set thing. It's kind of a parallel. It's sort of 1984 basically. It's a parallel 1940s where biscuits are ruthlessly controlled by the state, and the ministry exists to make sure biscuits don't get too tasty because you're not out of them. And there's a junior biscuit designer who falls in love with the secretary and creates the most elaborate biscuit ever designed. So that's all sort of 1940s pastiche music. And then we did one called Lord God, which is about God going on holiday to a 1920s Devon seaside resort. So that's sort of 1920s pastiche music. But although it sounds exactly, it perfectly captures the feeling of the period, it kind of becomes more than pastiche because Brian has this ability to put, real feeling into it. And for Gwenevere, he's produced I think it's a fantastic score. It's all sort of shawms and sackbuts and bassoons and medieval instruments and big pounding drums and things. It's lovely. Wait till you hear it. It's mostly arrangements of very early English music.
Amazing.
But no, it's just gorgeous. I think, again, I may, as a director, I may lack something, but as I think as a casting director, I'm quite good, and I think as a commissioner of the right composer, I think I'm quite good. So just come along and listen to the music if you ever get a chance.
What was your direction to Brian? Did you have anything in your mind that you thought, yeah, I've heard that somewhere else that might work?
Not really. I didn't. I'm not a very musical person, and I didn't really have a very strong idea of the music in my mind. And also, you know, Brian's a genius, so I just wanted to let him get on with it, really. I thought whatever he does is going to work. He's much cleverer than I am at that sort of stuff. And it did. And I didn't really, I don't think I really gave him very many points. I mean, occasionally a little bit too jolly or something. And with that sort of instrumentation, there's a danger that it starts to sound too clangersy sometimes. So that was a thing we had to avoid. But there's an opening scene where Gwenevere is in her sort of chamber and she's kind of stripped of her crown and robes and things, and for some reason the saraband that they use in Barry Lyndon had always stayed in my mind, just that rhythm of that. So I asked Brian if we could have a saraband, and we have got a saraband, and it sounds terrific.
Yeah.
So but that's about the only direction I gave him.
Fabulous. And what are you working on now that you can tell us about? Or
I've been doing a series of books called Utterly Dark, and The Face of the Deep was the first of them, which was it's kind of set in a sort of a vaguely Devon, Cornwall sort of island out in the Atlantic in the early 19th century, sort of Napoleonic times, and this island abuts an area of sea where strange things go on. It's weird and haunted, and magical goings on happen out there. And it's about a girl called Utterly Dark who finds that she's kind of connected to all this stuff. So it's very, I was really, you know, they're my favorites, I think, of the books I've written. They're sort of magical, historical things, and quite funny, I think, but it's character comedy rather than kind of goof off comedy. So I've written the second one of those, and I've just written a third, Utterly Dark and the Tides of Time, which will be out in the autumn. So currently I've just finished that one. They're quite Doctor Who-y, actually. They weren't meant to be, but they sort of, there's a point in the first one where seaweed monsters start bashing their way in through the windows of a house. And I thought, oh, this is a bit Doctor Who. And the third one has really lent into that. We have time travel and all sorts of things going on. So yeah, that's the current thing. And I'm writing Adventuremice books with Sarah McIntyre as well, which don't take me very long to write. And she spends months doing beautiful, beautiful watercolor illustrations. So I guess those are my current thing. I'm touring around a lot, publicizing Adventuremice.
You must never stop. I've just got a couple more questions. You mentioned Doctor Who. Now you wrote a Doctor Who novel. Is it e-novel, e-book?
What is it? I can't remember. It was when it was some anniversary of Doctor Who. Was it the 40th or the 50th? I can't remember. Yeah. And they got 12 writers, I guess, because there had been 12 doctors. It's all coming back to me. They got 12 writers to write little short books. They were actually published as individual little books and as a sort of bound up version. And I'm sure they're ebooks as well. And I'm not that much of a Doctor Who fan. I don't really follow it at all anymore. But they asked me to do the Fourth Doctor, the Tom Baker, and that was my era.
I love Tom Baker, and I love the Master. It's about that time.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure I remember him, but I started off. I wrote this story about the Doctor and Leela, and I found that I could just hear that. I hadn't watched any of these things. I watched them when I was 11 or 12, whatever it was, back in the late 70s. And I hadn't gone back to them. I hadn't ever seen them since. And I just could hear their voices in my head completely. I knew exactly what they were going to say to each other. It was extraordinary and I did then get a couple of DVDs just sort of, as research. And I found that I remembered them like line for line. It was extraordinary how deeply they'd gone in. I guess stuff does when you're that age, the stuff you love at that kind of sort of late childhood and early teens. I think that really stays with you. That's why I keep going back to Arthur. It's the same thing. So yeah, I was quite happy writing my little Doctor Who book, but I don't really like. There's a sort of, I think Doctor Who you sort of need kind of a body count, don't you? There's a sort of a horror element to Doctor Who, which I'm not really that comfortable writing. I don't really like writing horror. As a filmmaker too, obviously that's the one thing, the one genre where you can make something really cheaply and kind of.
Oh, definitely loads of zombies. Loads of zombies.
Yeah, but I just don't. I just don't like it. So I think I don't know if it's the most effective Doctor Who story, but I think I've sort of captured the voices quite well. I think
amazing. Well, thanks so much for your time today. It's been
Thank-
it's
thanks,
been brilliant.
Okay, thanks very much, John.